Good morning. Good morning. I'm Glenn Lowry, Director of the Museum of Modern Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this discussion with Christophe Chérix, Chief Curator of Drawings and Prints and co-organizer of this wonderful exhibition, Marcel Broodthaers, a retrospective, with Manola Borja from the Reina Sofia, our partner, and Manola is right here. And Manola, we thank you for joining with us on this terrific effort. Exhibitions of this scale and complexity are very difficult to pull off, and this one would have been impossible without the support, advice, guidance, and help of Maria Glisson Broodthaers, Broodthaers' widow, their daughter, Marie Puck, and we're so happy that you were able to spend so much time working with us on this project. And we also want to acknowledge Marcel Broodthaers' other children, Pierrette, Sylvie, and Constantin, and as well the Daled family, whose very generous gift to the museum several years ago of their collection included many critical works by Broodthaers that became a kind of catalyst for a deeper dive into this. And Herman and Nicole, and of course their son Pierre, we're so grateful that you're here as well. This project garnered widespread support from a number of funders, our International Council here at the Museum of Modern Art, Marie-José and Henry Kravis, Anna-Marie and Robert Shapiro, Jill and Peter Krause, the Junior Associates of the Museum of Modern Art, the General Representation of the Government of Flanders to the USA, and the Joe Carroll Lauder Publications Fund of the International Council, as well as the Museum of Modern Art's Wallace Annenberg Fund for Innovation in Contemporary Art. All of which is to say, Christophe, that we are thrilled to be here and to talk a little bit about an artist and an exhibition that I think are of great importance. Anyone who spent any time thinking about museums in the last couple of decades has had to contend not just with the art historians and historians who've thought about museums, but the artists who have interrogated the very idea of what it means to have a museum. And I don't think any artist has done that more thoughtfully or more powerfully than Marcel Broodthaers. So let's begin at the beginning. Broodthaers, I don't think, started out to be an artist. He started out as a poet. And do you want to talk a little bit about the journey that brought him to here?
Yes, absolutely. Broodthaers started as a poet, and the first 2 decades basically were devoted mostly to poetry, not exclusively. He did films, photograph, a number of other things. But he came to his first exhibition at the age of 40 years old, which is, at least for today, rather late, and without any training as an artist. Which I think is quite important to have in mind when you look at his work. For us, what really mattered in that exhibition also was to bring the poetry back. I think there is this idea that in '64, when he organized his first exhibition at Galerie Saint-Laurent, he stopped being a poet. And we wanted to go, Manolo and I, a little bit again that very idea, that he was a poet and remained a poet. He was a poet in a different way. He found new modes of expression, but still still inhabiting that world. So the exhibition really starts. The first room is really devoted to the first poetry book and those first 2 decades together with film. That's something people don't always have in mind, that before becoming a visual artist, he was already versed into film, and the first film is dedicated to Schwitters, so someone who will have a great importance on his career.
When you lay out an exhibition like this, especially with an artist who had a relatively compressed career, there's an awful lot of work that we have to absorb. And there are a lot of muscles, including a muscle pot, that we have to think about. Do you want to talk a little bit about the sort of early iconography of Broodthaers' work as it leads up to the, I hate to even use the word more mature, because again, he was a very mature man when he began working as an artist. But I want to start with the muscle pots and the muscles and think about what he was trying to achieve there.
One of his very early material before the muscle pots or the muscle shelves or the egg shelves is poetry. We have Ponce Bet, one of the first work in the exhibition. You see those volumes of unsold poetry books carefully embedded into plaster and becoming a sculpture. And around that work, you have, it's true, mussel shells, egg shells, and I think for him they had different meaning, complementary meaning. I mean, eggs was, everything starts with an egg. It's something very primary. And if you look even back at the end of the show, he's very interested in the letter A, the beginning of the alphabet. Again, it's this idea to throw something out in the world, a bit like a poet, and let us just associate it with the things we want to associate it with. So to create a system which is extremely open-ended. The mussel shells for him, I mean, if you, in French, a moule means two things, a mussel, but also a mold. So it's always also something which creates something through association. And I think those two objects were for him very meaningful because they were very much a starting point and allowing to create a form of relationship with the viewer which would allow him or her to appropriate the work and to understand it in a different way each time. So the show really tried to show how, by starting with those objects, slowly his work evolved and developed and became more and more complex, almost adding layers and layers to things that he started with.
And certainly with the eggshells, there's an inherent sense of fragility, of not just creation, but its opposite that I get, at least when I look at them.
And there's also a form of irreverence in Broodthaers. Of course, eggshells are discarded, mussel shells are discarded, and they're also extremely fragile for the eggshells. So he's basically asking ourselves, what are you going to do with those objects? Now that they almost can't travel, or they're very difficult to move from one place to another. And that's something which is a thread throughout his work. We really wanted to end the show with a tapis de sable, with a sand carpet, which has the same fragility. It's something extremely ephemeral in a way. And that goes back to Broodthaers' very first idea of trying to redefine what an art object can be. And one of the things that he asked himself was, what's the function of an art object? And one of the answers he had was, is it a function precisely not to have a function? And to take out the function of something in order to make a work of art. If you think of the beautiful white cabinet and white table, it's precisely what he did. You can't use a table anymore. You can't use a cabinet anymore. They became extremely fragile by being filled or covered with eggshells. So there's this kind of extremely sophisticated and deep thinking of what art means, really right at the beginning of his work. And does it allow us could back then, would we have understood that it would lead him to the museum? Maybe not, but there is a clear path, I think, from the very early objects to the later years.
Just to stay with some of the earlier objects for a moment, does one read this interest in the abstraction of, say, monochromatic color? In other words, the eggshells are white, the moule tend to be dark blue, black. Is he interested in problems of abstraction?
I'm not sure. For me, it's more like a form of typography. Mm-hmm. A text is black on white usually, and it comes out of that tradition and that knowledge of what does a text mean on a page. So for me, I associate that much more with this kind of literary background and this desire to project words in space and to detach them from their very own meaning. And that's, I think, another thing that you can feel very clearly in the exhibition, that the objects becomes words of a poem. They are freed by becoming art.
The heart of the exhibition is the remarkable series of projects that he did around his museum. And I think, again, every artist presumably wants their work at some point to be in a museum, and Broodthaers took charge and made his own museum, which is a very convenient way of ensuring that your work will be in a museum. And so, of course, when his museum is in another museum, we start to build up all the different layers of really what what constitutes a museum. And I want to start with at least something that's always interested me about Broodthaers' work, which is he makes us realize that a museum starts with an idea, even before it starts with objects. And do you want to walk us through the various iterations of his Musée d'Art Moderne,
Yes,
Département des Aigles?
the Musée d'Art Moderne, the Museum of Modern Art Department of Eagle, is clearly one of the maybe the centerpiece of his practice. But it's a museum, but not of his own work. You know, there are no works by Broodthaers in the museum. It's a museum made of postcards, of slideshow, a press release, of crates. So basically, is asking what is the function of art, you know, and what is the function of a museum. And I think that's a better platform for him. You know, if you think about how the show is built, the 2 rooms just before that, trying to make people aware how the question of display, of presentation becomes essential to his work in Le Corbeau et le Renard, in Mallarmé. And the museum is really an attempt to detach himself furthermore from the object and being someone who is who takes in a way a central but also marginal position, because he said he did say that he started becoming an artist, he started being an artist to become a director. Of course, there's a lot of irony. There's another provocation here. But it's a museum about museum. It's also a museum in which an artist regains control. You know, when we think about museums in the 60s and 70s, you know, they become more and more bureaucratic. You know, they suddenly led by historians, not by artists, as they often used to be, if you think earlier in the 20th century. So there's a way to think about the museum as a tool rather than something which preserves objects. And another thought I think which people need to have in mind when they think about the museum is like, this museum was in a way fictional but very real. So there were installations that people could go through, but scattered throughout Europe. So they were built over time, 4 years, 7 cities, 12 sections. So never a section that you would see, except at one exception, simultaneously. So this idea of dispersal, the idea that, as you said, the museum is an idea, and every time this idea is expressed, it's developed in a different way. And I think that's one of the great challenges of a Broodthaers show, is like what to do with the museum. And what we wanted to do is to keep its fragmentary nature, like not to come to the conclusion that if you add up all the sections, you have a museum. You don't. It's only the same idea, which is expressed in a different way, at a different time, in a different place.
So from the museum, which he worked on sporadically but consistently, we get to some of the later work, which create yet another kind of polarity, really. And I'm thinking of Art de Vivre, Art Militaire, and this kind of wonderful tension that you might say between, you know, these great cannons and leisure furniture that you might associate with somebody at a camping site. Do you want to delve into what was going on there?
I think in '72 he declares his museum bankrupt, and becomes
all too real, by the way.
And he becomes an artist again, but an artist who will just be a very different artist than he was before he started the museum. So you see the impact that project had on his own practice, and in a way he becomes a curator at that, like the art of display becomes absolutely central to his work. And he imagined this idea of decor. And again, thinking about art, how can we give a function to art again? In a decor, each object has a function. And he's going to recycle, reuse his older work in order to rearrange it in new constellation, in new arrangement, every time different, as often as retrospectives. And the exhibition you mentioned, which is presented in the retrospective, a decor, a conquest, which was premiered at the ICA, is maybe the ultimate decor in the sense that it's made with borrowed objects that he hadn't made for most of them. It's really an art of display, and trying to do two things at the same time, to think about this relation about lifestyles and military in the 19th century and the 20th century, so to opposition, but also to think about the opposition between the 19th century and the 20th century. What happened between those two centuries? So there's always this kind of extraordinary melancholy part of Broodthaers' work, which is not an artist who had faced in modernity. You know, the very idea of failure, the idea of that art doesn't always lead for the best, and society is not always something which progresses, I think is very much part of that work, because it makes you question the relationship between, let's say, canons and a Victorian decor, which seems today quite nice environment, but suddenly is a much more aggressive and terrifying opposition between leisure and machine gun or handgun. You know, this idea of, and you see a critique of our society, which I think has maybe never been expressed with that force by an artist before, at that time at least.
Yeah, I've always thought of the canons in a way as a kind of pun that he was playing with about museums, which are in the business of often articulating canons of art history. And here he's taking real canons and showing a different face to society. And that, I think, what's so hard to grasp sometimes is that sense of humor that's there, that there's a sense of seriousness and purposefulness to the various projects that Broodthaers pursued, but there's also a real understanding of irony and playfulness, as you said earlier.
I think one thing we wanted to also do is to bring Broodthaers as a person into the show, because I think, at least mostly in the United States, he was often turned into a cerebral or conceptual artist, and he was that also, but he was not only that. And you'll see it throughout the show, and it's really discussing with friends, collectors, dealers who met Broodthaers, and Herman is here and told us who he was a little bit. And we really wanted to have that figure, that presence into the exhibition. So the first room, Kurt Schwitters, you hear Broodthaers speaking. In the Mallarmé exhibition, you hear Broodthaers reciting a coup de dé himself. You'll see him in films. So the idea that he's very present, in a way, the work was very much linked to almost as a performance to the fact that he would inhabit a space with object, with his capacity to change completely an environment by just adding a couple of objects or regrouping older works. And that's another challenge of this exhibition, is try to bring the life back into the work, which often was maybe seen in the past more through archival images. And I think one of the goals was to trust the physicality of the work and of the displays, and try to rely mostly on those.
There are relatively few exhibitions that I can remember at the Museum of Modern Art that have become overrun by palm trees. What is the significance of those? And talk a little bit about the issue of evocation, that when one looks at the history of Broodthaers' own installations, how does one go about recreating them, evoking them, dealing with them?
I think the palm tree was, the first time they appear in a group show, which composed mostly of minimal and conceptual artists. And Broodthaers decided to stage the first version of Winter Garden. So there is a provocation there. What you have is slab on the floor, letters on the wall, and suddenly you have this kind of old-fashioned decor, which goes back to Belgian own history, its colonies, but almost an antiquated, in installation. So, and for him, those palm trees were first, at least when he installed them in '74, the stage for a film. So again, a work which creates something else by him inhabiting, that space. And what you see in the second version of Winter Garden that we are showing, you see not only the palm tree, but you see a film on which you see Broodthaers walking through the Palais de Bordard with a camel. So again, this idea to bring back exoticism, just try to work with opposition by surprise, And the palm tree over the years became, another signature of his work, as the mussel and maybe the eggshells used to be in the early 60s. And he reused them also within his own work, as he reused his mussel shells and eggshells. And the first piece you see when you enter the show, it's called the entrance of the exhibition. You see those giant palm trees with some of his work arranged as a mini retrospective, which again create that effect of surprise, this idea that you are not in a museum anymore. You are transported in a different place. So to think about the museum as something, again going back to the idea that the museum is an idea and can project it into an imaginary landscape.
Was he a romantic?
Well, he loved romantic poetry, at least.
Let us turn for a moment to all of you and see if there are any questions that you would like to ask. And please don't be hesitant or shy.
Maria.
Yes.
Well, we'll get you a microphone in 1 second.
I would like to answer your last question. Was he a romantic? And I would say yes, but he was a realist. So I say always, as one asks me, he is un romantique réaliste ou un réaliste romantique.
So thank you, Maria, that he was a romantic realist or a realist romantic. And I asked the question for a reason, because there's a tendency, at least for my generation, to read Broodthaers very seriously. And that what I think this exhibition tries to tease out of his work is the fullness of the artist, the fullness of the man, and that there is a whimsy there, right? Those provocations are not just meant to get people excited, but when you think about the kind of rigor of minimalism and post-minimalist art in the 60s and 70s, and the idea of these palm trees sort of interrupting that and making people sort of stop and ask themselves, what are they looking at and why? I think there's that quest for something higher, something even greater than just the object itself. And I think that's part of what this exhibition tries to tease out of Broodthaers' work. Other questions or thoughts that anyone would like to share? Yes, please, right there. We'll get you a microphone just so we can all hear you.
What is the significance of the eagle?
The eagle has many signification or no signification. I came to doubt that even. The eagle became, there's one section of the museum where basically put together every object that you can find, being fine art or just a bottle, with the sign of the eagle. And of course there is this kind of power attached to the eagle. There is this past as well. There is it's something coming from very deep into the centuries through association. So it's a very powerful emblem, But at the same time it's an empty emblem. You can find an eagle on a handkerchief or on a painting. So it's something which has all meanings but no meaning, something which is just a shell. And I think for him it was a perfect image in order to represent something which, it wasn't about the eagle, but it was about the power of the image of the eagle.
But I also think one of the beauties of his museum, right? The Museum of Modern Art, Musée d'Art Moderne. So, it's immediate evocation of institutions like this one or many others in Europe. And then instead of having a department of art or a department of 20th century, it has a department of eagles, right? I mean, you have to smile. You just have to say, okay, he's getting at the taxonomy of museums, right? We are all organized structurally, either chronologically or by media or by some theme. And what he's saying is, think about it. At least the way I read it is, think about it. Does it really make sense the way you've organized your museum when he's speaking to the museum at large? At least that's how I read it. Please.
I see these eagles and palm trees and shells and oysters and so forth. They're all poetic interventions of one kind or another from my point of view. And with those interventions, there is always a dash of irony. And it occurred to me that the other artist I know who uses palm trees is John Baldessari. But, you know, and it's also ironic. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that effect in terms of a comparison.
I think John is from LA, so palm tree has a they're more part of his, you know, his daily life. But clearly, I think, not to speak for John Baldessari, but you know, this idea of leisure in John Baldessari, which is very, you know, but there is something much more, again, casual in the reference to palm tree that maybe someone using palm tree in the early 70s in Brussels. You know, there is this kind of displacement, which I feel is much stronger in terms of impression and that it has on the viewer.
But also, Christophe, my sense, at least from the documentary photography that I've seen, is that many of Broodthaers' installations took place in Beaux-Arts buildings. And those Beaux-Arts buildings, certainly in Europe, I'm thinking of late Victorian even buildings, they had, you know, palm trees as part of their, not art, but part of the sort of ambiance. And is he not also kind of pulling that out as well?
I think what interested was everything but the art.
Right.
You know, if you think about how he's going to study and to interrogate the museum, is to remove what we consider essential, the art object, and he's going to question everything around the taxonomy, the advertisement department of a museum, the way we distribute things, the way we announce events. You know, so and palm trees are part of that. There's a decor, a decor. You know.
Other questions, please. Yes, in the middle there.
There are lots of tributes to René Magritte in the exhibition. I wanted to ask you if you could spoke a bit to the dialogue between both artists.
They met each other early in the mid 40s. Magritte was I think very important for Broodthaers in many ways. One of them, which is his understanding and his love for Stéphane Mallarmé. I mean, when he met Magritte suggested him to read Mallarmé, and you see how Mallarmé is extremely present in the exhibition. Even if you think about this room where you have the black floor, which is a close echo of a show that he had organized. The 4 vacuum form blades are pipes. So they pay homage to Magritte to allow him to understand the significance and the importance of Mallarmé. And in other ways, Magritte is a master of the relation between words and image. So they had a deep, interesting relationship. Magritte, I think, even was a supporter of Broodthaers' work. As other artists, you know, if you think of Broodthaers, what we wanted to show is the importance of Magritte, but also the importance of Schwitters, of Mallarmé and Baudelaire and so on. So Broodthaers had a number of artists on which he paid frequently homage to, and he found sometimes inspiration and tried to bring their work into a different dimension. And I think if you think of the relationship of Broodthaers and Magritte, he takes things from Magritte, but he projects them in a completely new universe. And there is something, in fact, very moving in that relationship.
Other questions? Yes, right there, please.
Does he have a standing in a purely literary world, except besides his artistic ever?
Not so much. I mean, he published a number of poetry books, so he was part of the literary scene in Brussels. So he published in important literary magazines, but not that often. And one of the difficulties he had, he couldn't live from his poetry. Like, it wouldn't provide him a living and an existence. And his poetry was, I think, kept to a small number of people. So I think he was a poet known in Brussels, but without, I would say, recognition much beyond that.
Other questions? If not, before we close, I should remind everybody that after the exhibition is finished here at the Museum of Modern Art, it will travel to Madrid and the Reina Sofia, where Manola Borja is not just the co-curator of this exhibition, but also the very talented director. And from Madrid, it will conclude its tour in Dusseldorf. So it will be seen widely over the coming year plus, and we're thrilled to be able to celebrate its opening here at the Museum of Modern Art today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.